Nick Drake left behind 3 albums which were met with indifference at the time, but has since influenced countless contemporary artists, including The Cure's Robert Smith, Lucinda Williams, REM, Blur, Beck, Coldplay. The list goes on. Brad Pitt and Heath Ledger were both fans, both involved in tributes captured by the Nick Drake mystique. Well, a tribute to the songs of Nick Drake called Way to Blue will be performed at the Sydney Opera House this Friday night and Melbourne's Recital Hall next week. This show was a huge hit in the UK, and its curator is Joe Boyd, former producer and friend of Nick Drake. He joins us along with one of the performers in the Way to Blue concert, Scott Matthews. Joe, Scott, welcome to breakfast.
Great to be here.
Joe Boyd, let's start with you. What is the magic of Nick Drake that survives almost 40 years after his death?
Well, to put it bluntly, it was very good, but it was also quite unusual at the time. I remember when I heard his music the first time, I couldn't figure out what his influences were. They were so, you could hear a little bit of Dylan, a little bit of Donovan, a little bit of Bert Jansch maybe, but it was just so different and so literate. And I think that was one of the reasons it had trouble, was that it was hard to categorize. But that is part of the reason that I think that it survives, because it doesn't sound like a 60s cliche.
And are we talking about the songwriting, or are we talking about the sound and something about the essence of the man? I mean, tell us about the Nick Drake that you knew.
Nick was a very sensitive, very shy, but incredibly bright guy who spent a lot of time alone in his room figuring out very complicated guitar tunings. And, you know, his guitar playing was so deft and so complicated that it's been very difficult. People just only recently have really figured out exactly what he was doing on a lot of those songs. But also his lyrics, I think a lot of people who imitate Nick kind of sing in a kind of breathy way, and there were sensitive lyrics. And then I think to myself, that's nothing really, not a patch on Nick, because he was, you know, educated in all the Romantic poets, and he knew the canon of English poetry, and he wrote these really original and subtle and kind of very literate lyrics, I would say.
When he brought you his demo, I guess it was back in the late 60s, he came to you with a demo tape. What did you think when you heard it?
I was immediately stunned. I just thought, this is incredible. I've got to go in the studio with this guy immediately. This was within about 30 seconds. So that it's always been a source of great frustration to me that in his lifetime people didn't respond like that.
And why didn't they? What was the response like?
There was a review in Melody Maker of the first album, which I had forgotten about, and someone showed it to me many years after his death. And it said, an awkward mixture of folk and cocktail jazz. And I could, you could sort of see
That's a fairly ugly description, isn't it, really?
Yeah, but that was sort of the people didn't quite know what to make of it.
An awkward mixture of folk and cocktail jazz. It's not really the sort of stuff you'd expect someone like The Cure to be interested in, or REM, or he wasn't writing rock music as such.
No, but I think you can hear in the world of rock singing, and certainly singer-songwriters these days, that people are singing, and partly it's because of the technology, the microphones and everything, but also I think Nick had an effect on the way people sing more quietly, more intimately. There's a sort of understated quality to a lot of singing today, which he was one of the first ones to do.
But, back at that time, if you think back, there was a lot of that kind of sound too that went well, Donovan, for instance, was singing those kind of soft, dreamy lyrics. You'd think that time would be perfect for a Nick Drake song.
It just, I don't know, it just sounded different. Well, what can I tell? The other problem, of course, was that he was so shy on stage, and in those days you didn't have guitar rustlers coming on and off stage with differently tuned guitars, and he had to take 3 minutes to tune his guitar between songs, and he had no jokes and no patter. And people just drifted away, started clinking glasses.
You're listening to ABC Radio National Breakfast. Our guests this morning in the breakfast studio, Joe Boyd and Scott Matthews, and they're here to talk about Way to Blue, which is a tribute concert, already been a smash hit around the UK over recent years. It's a tribute to the singer-songwriter Nick Drake. Joe Boyd, you've seen a lot of acts. You've helped make a lot of acts make it big. You were there in the early days of Pink Floyd, Fairport Convention. You had a hand with Billy Bragg, Maria Muldoon. How did an American get such an influential role in the British music scene of the 70s and beyond?
I think that in the 60s, there weren't that many people going back and forth between, travel was not as free and easy as it is today. And I think that I brought to Britain a kind of vision of a lack of a separation between the folk world and the pop world. And so I would hear something in a folk club and think how it could go to a wider audience in a way that maybe British people weren't thinking at that time. I don't know. I just was lucky. It was a great time to be in London in the 60s.
I know you've written about it. You've got a book called Making Music. It's called White Bicycles, Making Music in the 60s. So you've obviously analysed it a fair bit. In a sense, do you see something familiar with the time we're in now? Is there also more of a place for a folk sound emerging in our, let's call it, pop music scene?
Well, certainly there is that. I think that it's an interesting time because I think over the last 15, 20 years, records got much more manufactured. The way people produce records with Pro Tools and doing all the tweaking, making perfect sounds, led people to want more live music because you don't get that live feeling off records. And I think just as much as big rock festivals are huge, also I think just hearing people play acoustic instruments who are really virtuosic on that is something that's really burgeoned in the last through world music and through folk music and acoustic music. And it's an interesting time,
And there's two pressures leading to more live music. It's that you just described, but also as CD sales down, musicians have to get out and start singing and sell tickets and get people to come and see them. They're making money that way too. With everything we know about Nick Drake in hindsight, it probably wouldn't have been a great time for Nick Drake now either, given his awkwardness on stage.
Well, I think once people learn to love and that was my idea, my plan, my big plan, which didn't work, was that we'd put out this great record and everybody would recognize how great it was. And then they'd come to his shows and sit very quietly, respectfully, and wait for him to finish tuning his guitar because they knew the songs and they were, and because the record didn't do that well, that part of the plan didn't work. But I think if he had the following that he has now and he suddenly was among us, I think you'd have huge halls filled with hushed audiences waiting patiently for him to finish tuning his guitar.
Well, Nick Drake isn't amongst us, sadly, but the tribute concerts have been a huge hit across the UK, Way to Blue. Tell us a bit about how Way to Blue and how it came about.
Birmingham Town Hall was putting together a weekend of English originals, and they asked me to put together a tribute, and we got Robert Kirby, who had done the arrangements for Nick's records, and he brought his arrangements and 7-string players, and we had Neil McCall, who's a guitar. He's coming here as well to Australia. He's Ewan McCall's son, and he's the man who has the most accurate and perfect and wonderful recreation of Nick's guitar parts. And Danny Thompson, the great bass player, who played on many of Nick's records. He's part of the band. We put together this band, and we've had, over the course of about 12 concerts, we've had people like Martha Wainwright and Lisa Hannigan, who's coming here, and Robin Hitchcock, who's coming here, and
are we going to see that concert here in Sydney and Melbourne, or is there Australian artists as part of this lineup?
We have added 2 Australian artists, Shane Nicholson, and this wonderful woman and her partner who I heard just by accident. Somebody sent me the record, and I listened to it. I didn't even know where it was from. We were looking for a female singer. And I looked on the back of the CD and went, oh, it was made in Sydney. They're called Luluc, L-U-L-U-C. And I think she's a great singer. Anyway, she's going to be part of the show as well.
Well, Scott Matthews is going to be part of the show too. Scott, you've been sitting quietly while I've had the chat with Joe. You're a young English singer-songwriter born, I think, after Nick Drake died. I
was born in 1976.
Had you heard of Nick Drake before you were invited to this lineup?
I didn't discover Nick Drake till quite late on, actually. I think it was around about 2003 or something. And it was my missus who kind of gave me the CD. I think it was on one of his songs was on an acoustic compilation CD. And I was instantly kind of taken with the whole feel of you know, especially being on a compilation CD, these songs just kind of just leapt out. And out of all the songs on this CD, this kind of just kept resonating, you know, I think it was Riverman that was a song on the CD, and it was one of those where I just continued the journey really, and just discovered all the stuff he'd done, and then obviously discovered the story of, you know, of what he was about, and you know, what he's left behind and everything. And but yeah, thankfully the music's still there, and it's influencing. I dare say in 50, 60, 70 years time, it will have the cycle will continue again, and people will discover it, you know, and that's part of the charm of what his music's about for me. Yeah.
So what's the tribute song you're going to sing this morning?
From the Morning, actually. It's a song off Pink Moon, possibly my favourite Nick Drake album. Yeah, and I think it's quite appropriate as well.
Should we have a listen?
Let's go for it. Yeah. Okay. Okay, here we go. Day once dawned, and it was beautiful. The day once dawned from the ground. Then the night she fell, and the air was beautiful. The night she fell all around. So look, see the days, the endless colored ways, and go play the game that you learned from the morning. Look, see the sights, the endless summer nights, and go play the game that you learned from the morning.
Scott Matthews with some of that bittersweet complexity, Nick Drake complexity we've been discussing this morning. Scott Matthews, Joe Boyd, thank you very much for joining us on Breakfast.
Thank you.
Pleasure, thanks.